What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with our coverage of the Dark Multiverse saga at DC Comics, and we're continuing with Justice Incarnate issue number 2, which all of this directly segues into the events of the Dark Multiverse and tells us just how bad things really are. So what we end up doing here is we basically pick up with what was initially what we saw at the end of the last video, which is basically the forces of Darkseid attacking the House of Heroes. That's not going to become overly important until we get to the very end of the story. Just know that that's still just kind of going on in the background. What is important here is the Justice Incarnate. Remember, they're trying to find the crack in the multiverse. Now, the crack in the multiverse is as much a meta commentary as it is a physical thing. It is quite literally a crack. The problem with this is it keeps transitioning and shifting around the multiverse. And so the Justice Incarnate has to chase it around the multiverse until they finally catch it. The reason why this matters is because that crack in the multiverse is what will allow the Great Darkness to enter into the positive multiverse and basically destroy everything, right? Just annihilate everything in existence. And so in their attempts to find the crack, the Justice Incarnate actually ends up finding themselves on Earth 13. Now, Earth 13 is a really interesting universe. It's one that you don't see very often in DC Comics. This was initially given to us in the Multiversity Guidebook by Grant Morrison. The Multiversity Guidebook is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a bit of a story, but most of it is just giving us a quick one paragraph or maybe 2 or 3 sentence explanation on the different universes that exist as part of the greater multiverse as it was created by Grant Morrison. And so Earth 13 is a universe where everything is based on 13, right? 13 months and 13 hours in a day. But the other part of this is that it is a world that is caught in perpetual twilight. It's always dark. The sun never rises here. Now, there is also a bit of an explanation that's given, which, you know, is we can kind of basically talk about it here, that when it comes to the realms between magic and reality, there's a kind of dividing layer there. And in DC Comics, when it comes to the main DC universe, that veil is pretty strong. And that's why you never really see much crossover between anybody outside of like John Constantine or Swamp Thing with like the rest of the DC superheroes. But in this reality, it's all basically the same thing. And so the way this plays out is that once the Justice Incarnate basically get to what is in effect a secret entrance, they utter the password and they're met by Constantine in this reality, who basically like welcomes them to the Tavern of Mystery, right? Now, one of the things he says here is, if you're going to be in this place, like, one, Constantine and all these guys here, they're all well aware of the multiverse. And that's one of the things that I hope you're picking up on, is that seemingly everybody outside of the main superheroes in the DC universe have a full understanding of the multiverse and exactly what's happening out there right now. A lot of it's because they end up sending members of their forces out into the multiverse for any number of things, but they're far more involved with what's happening on a multiversal level than the superheroes from the main DC universe. But what Constantine also says is, let me get together basically the League of Shadows, so essentially this reality's version of what you would call the Justice League. Let me get them together, explain everything that's going on. While you're here, do not drink anything and do not look at anybody for too long, right? Because this is a place where everybody's on edge and a fight could break out at any moment. And given how powerful some of the forces are here, it's entirely possible that some of these guys could be killed. But one of the other things that goes on, and it's kind of a funny moment here, is you do have Dr. Multiverse who approaches Calvin, right? President Superman, and like she's digging him. And I wouldn't be surprised if she was interested in knocking the boots in some capacity. Now, of course, he shoots her down and he's like, I don't have time for it. I've got more important things going on. And that's when he's pulled aside by Thomas Wayne. And he's like, look, man, just a word from the wise. I am a guy who's lost virtually everything. Now, I was reunited with my son, and I finally get to know that even if in a different universe, my son lives on and becomes everything that I hoped that he would become, but my wife Martha's lost to me. Now, for those of you guys who don't know the significance of that, Thomas Wayne is Flashpoint Batman. So in his reality, which we did cover that story, and we'll link to it down in the description of this video, as well as a card that you'll see pop up here in the video. In his reality, in the Flashpoint universe, basically the way things played out is that instead of Thomas and Martha Wayne being shot and killed by Joe Chill, it was Bruce Wayne who was shot and killed. This led to Thomas Wayne becoming Batman, albeit without nearly the amount of gadgetry that we're traditionally used to seeing with Batman. But Martha Wayne went insane and became the Joker, which was just an amazing concept in the story. And so ultimately, Thomas ended up having to kill his wife. And that's basically why he says, like, she's lost to him forever now, because even if he hadn't killed her, her brain was just permanently gone. There was no means for her to recover. She was just lost forever. And so in life, spite of that, Calvin's just kind of like, I mean, she is kind of hot, right? You know, like Dr. Multiverse is kind of, you know, maybe we might see what's going on. Right? We might go find a quiet spot and lock some lips, you know, that kind of a thing. But before he finally gets over to her, he's met by this reality's version of Dr. Fate. Now, this is one of those instances when we find out that it wasn't just Machine Head on Earth 8 and like Yellow Lantern, Joker, and those guys that ceded their world to Darkseid, that it was actually the guys here who did it as well. But not everybody knew what was going on. That when it came to the guys on this world, they didn't know that they had handed their universe over to Darkseid. Instead, they thought that they were basically staving off any kind of multiversal calamities that would lead to like their universe or their Earth being affected. It wasn't until later on they realized that it was happening with Darkseid. Now, this is one of the things that I want to specify here, and this is one of the things that's so cool. Whenever you think of Darkseid in DC Comics, you usually think of Darkseid like invading the main DC universe. You know, that's usually when you always see him, is when he's invading the main DC universe. But this has callbacks to like the old Earth 2 story in the New 52. So in that storyline, which we never actually covered here, but we probably should have, it was Darkseid who was on the hunt for his daughter Grail, but he was also attacking various worlds across the multiverse. So the Earth 2 story was, it didn't really involve Darkseid himself. He was attacking the main DC universe at the time. It actually involved him sending Steppenwolf to attack that reality, and Steppenwolf succeeded. Batman ended up destroying himself to try to stop the parademons. Wonder Woman was killed by Steppenwolf. Superman was turned into a parademon. The important thing is that when you look at that story and you look at this story, it gives you this realization that Darkseid's essence, right, the fear that makes him who he is permeating across the multiverse. Everybody knows the name of Darkseid, and everyone fears the name of Darkseid. They do what they can to stand against him, but knowing that Darkseid's out there and knowing Darkseid could be coming for your universe is enough to send a shiver down the spine of virtually anybody out there. And so that's why this is such a big deal, is because these guys didn't know they were ceding their world to Darkseid. If they had, they probably wouldn't have done it in the first place. Now, initially, a fight starts to break out between Fate and Superman, but then that's when you end up having Etrigan, the super demon, who shows up. Now, that's one of the other big differences here, is that unlike having Jason Blood, who basically made a bargain with demons and ultimately bonded himself to Etrigan, and that's kind of the other half, in the same way that like Bruce Banner becomes the Incredible Hulk, Jason Blood becomes Etrigan, that what ended up happening here is Etrigan's origin actually mirrors that of Superman, where he was sent away from a dying world, he landed on Earth, and he'd basically been there ever since. But he is, by all standards of measurement, what you would call this reality's version of Superman. That's how far-reaching magic is here. Everything is based on magical energy, as opposed to magical energy just being a portion of what you see in the main DC universe. And so, of course, with Etrigan showing up here, this basically leads to Fate just fleeing for his life. And so what you get is Etrigan, who leads the Justice Incarnate to who is essentially Zatanna, kind of the lead magical person in this reality, and she sits down with the entire team and says, we need to stare at the crystal orb, we need to get a better idea of what's going on out there in the multiverse so we know exactly where to send you in order to locate this crack, because the reality here is that they weren't supposed to land in this universe, but they ended up arriving here instead. The problem with this is that when the observations are made within this orb, the sheer amount of chaos that exists out there in the multiverse is enough to basically crack it. That this war that's coming is a colossal event. It's massive in scale, bigger than anything that we've ever seen with regards to a multiversal crisis that's happened in DC Comics. That's the way they're billing it here. And so where you initially have like all the different members of the Justice Incarnate who were basically set on fire, the reality is that they're being engulfed by the orb and teleported away. They basically emerge or arrive directly where the crack is at. The problem here is that when they arrive where this crack is located, it's actually Darkseid and Asmodal fighting each other. Now, Asmodal is a guy that we've never really talked about. Think of him as like another version of Lucifer, that where Lucifer had basically challenged God and then been cast down from heaven into hell, that following that, Asmodal tried to do the exact same thing. That's why he has the nickname of the Angel King, the guy that tried to lead a rebellion against God, or at least another rebellion against the presence. The important thing to take away from this is that, one, this conflict is taking place at the very edge of the multiverse, before you get to what is in effect the source. The second thing to take away from here is that this is Darkseid in his true form. This is the most powerful Darkseid's ever been. This guy Asmodal is going toe-to-toe with him. Now, you can extrapolate things here, and you could say, okay, given this level of Darkseid, and given the power that Asmodal basically represents, you could argue that Darkseid is potentially on par with Lucifer Morningstar in terms of power. There's nothing definitive to say that, and you can't take it as an absolute truth, and we're not going to do that here. It's really more of just inferring this is potentially what DC's telling us here, but these are two of the most powerful beings in existence right now, and their fight is extreme. So much so that there's nothing the Justice Incarnate can really do here. Not only that, while this fight's taking place and the Justice Incarnate is trying to track down the crack and locate it, remember, Dr. Multiverse can see across the multiverse, see everything in the multiverse all at once. And one of the things she realizes is that Darkseid is not the only person hunting for the crack, that while Darkseid's doing his thing, that the Great Darkness has servants under his control, and the Great Darkness has sent those servants out into the multiverse to find that crack, to bring it to the Great Darkness, so the Great Darkness can enter the multiverse itself. And that's what Dr. Multiverse says, is like, there are other servants of the Great Darkness on their way here right now, and one of them is literally appearing at this moment, which turns out to be the Batwoman who laughs. Now, I love this concept. I love the idea of an evil Batwoman, partly because it's just the most relevant her character has been in years, and two, because I love the concept of the Batman who laughs, and I'd love to see a different variant on it. I mean, obviously this is happening because the general idea of the Batman who laughs is just hugely popular, but the important thing here is that this Batwoman who laughs is not from the dark multiverse. The Batwoman who laughs is from the positive multiverse. She's from Earth 11. Now, this is a cool thing because she's an agent of the Great Darkness, which means she's empowered by the energy, even if only a small portion of it, of the Great Darkness itself. This power she possesses is enough that she overpowers the entirety of the Justice Incarnate, to the point that they realize the only thing they can do to keep her contained is to whisk her away to the House of Heroes, to their base of operations, and keep her locked away there. But they don't know that the House of Heroes is under attack from the forces of Darkseid as kind of a secondary confrontation. And so while this is going on, right, while Batwoman who laughs is just wreaking havoc on the Justice Incarnate, what ends up happening is Calvin, President Superman, tells Dr. Multiverse, send her to the House of Heroes, right? Whisk her away, teleport her away there, and the people of the House of Heroes will basically take care of that. The problem is, once she gets there, she actually ends up adding to the chaos as opposed to stopping the chaos. And so as a result of that, the House of Heroes has no option but to basically detonate the entirety of their location, because if the House of Heroes headquarters is taken over by the Batwoman who laughs, or even the forces of Apocalypse, they'll be able to use the House of Heroes to go anywhere in the multiverse they want to. They'll have an easier job of finding the crack than like the Justice Incarnate, because they're currently just kind of lost in the multiverse right now. And so as a result of that, detonating this basically stops the forces of Apocalypse, and it stops the Batwoman who laughs from being able to find the crack in the multiverse, harness it, and use it, and hand it over to the Great Darkness. And so this whole self-destruct sequence is initiated. The problem with this is that it has a ripple effect, right? One of the things to keep in mind is the Justice Incarnate is kind of tethered to the House of Heroes in the sense that they can be teleported back at almost any point in time, but their ability to travel through the multiverse is anchored through the House of Heroes base of operations. When the House of Heroes is destroyed, it sends a shockwave that affects the Justice Incarnate and scatters them throughout the entirety of the multiverse. This is cool because what we get to see is basically going forward this kind of tour of the multiverse that ultimately culminates in them coming back together and facing off against what may very well be the single most powerful being to ever exist in the history of DC Comics, which is not true form Darkseid. Somebody powerful enough to overcome true form Darkseid. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.